My daughter was 16 years old when she looked me in the eye across the kitchen table and said the words I had never prepared myself to hear. "You're not my real mother." She said it the way teenagers say things designed to wound. Quickly, cleanly, with just enough eye contact to make sure it landed. I had burned my hand on the stove that morning. The bandage on my palm was still white. I was gripping the edge of the counter with that same hand, and the pain was the only thing keeping my face still. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I set down the dish towel I was holding, folded it in thirds the way my mother taught me, and said very quietly, "I know you're angry. We can talk about this when you're ready." Then I walked to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. Because here is the thing my daughter did not know. She was right. And she was also completely, entirely, devastatingly wrong. And the DNA test she demanded 3 weeks later, the one she was so certain about, didn't just change her life. It cracked open a truth about our entire family that went back 50 years before either of us was born. And once a truth like that is out, you cannot put it back. Not ever. My name is Miriam Cross. I am 52 years old. I live in Tucson, Arizona, with too many plants and a dog named Gerald, who has never once complicated my life. I have one daughter. Her name is Nadia. She is 22 now, finishing graduate school, and last month she called me on a Sunday morning just to talk. No agenda, no crisis. Just to talk. I sat on my back porch with my coffee going cold and thought about how many miles we had traveled to arrive at a Sunday morning with no agenda. A very long way. This is that story. All of it. Including the parts that are hard to say out loud. Stay with me. I was 24 when I married Thomas Cross. We met in graduate school. He studied architecture. I was finishing a degree in social work. We were the kind of couple that looks inevitable from the outside. He was careful and structured. I was instinctive and adaptive. He made plans. I changed them when they needed changing, which they always do. We were good together. For a long time, genuinely good together. We tried to have children for 4 years. I won't walk you through everything those 4 years contained. Anyone who has lived them knows. Anyone who hasn't doesn't need the details to understand the weight. 4 years of trying changes you in ways that are difficult to articulate and impossible to fully undo. It changes how you move through time. It changes your relationship with your own body. It changes the texture of hope, which starts out bright and certain and becomes, if you survive long enough, something quieter and more complicated and more durable. We were eventually told, in the careful language doctors use for things they cannot fix, that biological children were unlikely for us. We decided to adopt. People sometimes treat adoption as a consolation, the thing you do when the thing you wanted didn't happen. It started that way for us, if I am being fully honest. But very quickly, it became something else entirely. Something I don't have a precise word for, except to say that the moment we stopped grieving what we couldn't have and started moving toward what we could, something in me unlocked. I researched agencies. I prepared documents. I built a nursery in the second bedroom, with the focused energy of someone who has finally found the direction they're supposed to be moving in. Nadia came to us when she was 4 days old. Through a domestic private adoption arranged through an agency we had worked with for 14 months. Her birth mother was 19 years old. A college student whose family was not in a position to support her, who had made a decision requiring more courage than I have ever given her full credit for. We were given basic medical history. We were given a name, the name the birth mother had chosen for her, Nadia, and which we kept because it was already hers before it was ours. I held her for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in March. She was 4 days old, 6 pounds 11 ounces. She fit against my collarbone like she had always been planning to be there. Thomas cried. I did not, which surprised me. I just looked at her for a very long time and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for years. We brought her home. We became a family. It was that simple, and it was that complicated, and for a long time, For many years, it was also that good. We told Nadia she was adopted when she was 5 years old. I want to be clear about that because it matters. We did not hide it. We did not wait until the right moment became an emergency. We told her early, gently, in the language a 5-year-old can receive, with a children's book we had read 6 times before that conversation, so we knew exactly how it went. Some babies grow in their mommy's belly. Some babies grow in their mommy's heart. She had grown in mine. She accepted it the way 5-year-olds accept things presented as simply true. A few questions. Then she asked for a snack. We exhaled. We thought we had handled the hard part. The hard part begins at 12. Or 13. Or 14. It begins whenever adolescence begins, which is different for every child and impossible to predict. And what it brings with it, the identity questions, the need to understand where you come from, the particular intensity of the search for self that happens when a person is in the process of becoming, all of that arrived in Nadia like weather, sudden, total, not particularly interested in our schedule. She started asking about her birth mother around 13. Reasonable questions at first. What did she look like? Where was she from? Why had she made the decision she made? I answered what I could. The adoption was closed, meaning the birth mother had not consented to future contact. The agency had given us limited information. I watched Nadia absorb this. I watched her file it somewhere internal, and I noticed, over the following years, that something in her relationship with me shifted. Not dramatically, not in a single moment I could point to, but by degrees so small that I couldn't identify the change until it had already become something significant. She talked to me less. She came to me with things less often. She looked at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not hostile. Evaluating. As if I were a problem she was still working out the shape of. Thomas noticed it too. We talked about it quietly at night, slightly afraid of our own observations. What neither of us knew was that while Nadia was trying to understand where she came from, I was sitting on a secret of my own. A secret that had nothing to do with her adoption, and everything to do with what had happened the year before she arrived. I am going to tell you what that secret was. But first I need to tell you about the year before Nadia came. The year that almost ended our family before it truly began. Because without that year, nothing that happened with the DNA test makes sense. And once I tell you this part, everything else in this story will look different than it did before. Stay with me. The year before Nadia came to us, Thomas and I separated. We have never spoken about this publicly. Not to our families. Not to friends. Not to Nadia. 2 months. Quietly. While we were simultaneously in the final stages of the adoption process. I moved into a short-term rental. Thomas stayed in the house. We told the adoption agency nothing because the separation felt temporary and we could not risk it derailing the process that had consumed the previous year of our lives. It did pass. We reconciled. We came back together with the specific determination of 2 people who have seen the alternative and chosen each other anyway. We went to therapy. We did the work. We didn't speak of it afterward because speaking of it felt like reopening something we had successfully closed. During those 2 months, I made a decision I have never stopped thinking about. One evening, one decision, with someone who had been a close friend and who I have not spoken to since. I am not going to dress it up in softer language. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong at the time, and I did it anyway, because I was lonely and frightened and not thinking about consequences. 6 weeks after Thomas and I reconciled, I discovered I was pregnant. After 4 years of trying. After being told it was unlikely, I was pregnant. My doctor used the word remarkable. I sat in the parking lot of that medical office for 45 minutes before I could drive, because I did not know, with complete certainty, whose child I was carrying. I told Thomas that evening. He was overwhelmed with joy in a way I hadn't seen in years. He held me and said things about miracles and timing and the universe. I held him back and said the appropriate things and did not say what I was thinking. which was that I needed to know something before either of us could fully feel what he was feeling. I never got the answer. 8 weeks in, I miscarried. It was swift and complete and devastating in a specific way I have never found adequate language for. The loss layered on top of the fear, layered on top of the guilt, layered on top of the grief, all of it arriving at once. None of it able to be spoken, because speaking any layer required explaining all the others. I told Thomas I was devastated. I was. I did not tell him I was also carrying a question that had just become unanswerable. I put the question away. We moved forward. Nadia came. Life continued in the direction life continues when you choose to let it. The question stayed buried for 16 years, until my daughter demanded a DNA test. I need you to understand something before I tell you what the test revealed. I was not afraid of what it would show about Nadia. Her adoption was documented, legal, completely above board. I had nothing to hide about her. What I was afraid of was the database, the matching function, the part of consumer DNA testing that nobody fully thinks through when they order the kit. The part that doesn't just show your ancestry, the part that cross-references your DNA against every other person who has ever submitted a test to the same platform. The part that finds relatives. The part that finds relatives you didn't know you had. The part that cannot be unrun once it runs. I said yes to the test immediately. I ordered my own kit at the same time because Nadia asked me to do it with her, and saying no would have told her something I wasn't ready to say. I swabbed. I sealed. I mailed. And then I waited for whatever was coming. The kits went out on a Monday. Results estimated in 3 to 4 weeks. I spent those weeks in a state I can only describe as suspended, not quite anxious, not quite calm, existing in the particular stillness of someone waiting for a verdict they have no power to influence. Nadia's results came first. She sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and opened them on her laptop. I sat across from her with coffee I wasn't drinking, watching her face. She scrolled slowly. She was quieter than I expected, more moved than I had anticipated for someone who had been so certain about what she was looking for. She had Eastern European ancestry she hadn't known about, a genetic marker for something minor and manageable that we immediately flagged for her doctor, and in the database, a distant biological relative on her birth mother's side. A thread she could pull if she chose to. A door she could open or leave closed, entirely on her own terms. She looked up at me when she finished reading. "Thank you for letting me do this," she said. It was the first uncomplicated thing she had said to me in months. I held on to it. Then she asked about my results. My results had arrived the previous evening. I had opened them alone in my bedroom with the door closed. I had opened the file expecting ancestry percentages, a map with colored regions. What I found instead stopped me so completely that I sat without moving for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I checked the time before I opened the results and checked it again when I finally moved. 11 minutes. The database had flagged a close biological relative match, not a distant cousin, not a third or fourth degree connection, a close match, the kind the database labels as immediate family, parent, child, or sibling. The name attached to the profile was a man I had never heard of in my life. Paul Osei. I was an only child. My parents were deceased, which meant this match was something else entirely. I went back to the kitchen. Nadia was still at the table. She had refilled her coffee. She had not touched her phone, which told me everything about how seriously she was taking this moment. I sat down. I put my hands flat on the table, and I told her I needed to make one phone call before I showed her my results, that there was something I needed to understand first before I handed it to her without context. She said okay. She trusted me in that moment, in a way she hadn't trusted me in years. I could feel it. I went to my bedroom and called a stranger whose DNA matched mine as immediate family. What he told me in the next 40 minutes changed the story I had been telling myself about my own life for 52 years. Paul Osei answered on the second ring. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who has been expecting a call they're not sure how to handle. I told him who I was, my name, my age, that I had received a close match notification and didn't understand it, that I was an only child, that both my parents were gone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I might be your brother." I sat down on the floor of my bedroom. My legs made that decision without consulting me. He told me what he knew. His mother, Dorothy, 81 years old, living in a memory care facility in Atlanta. She had told him several years ago, during a period of late-life honesty that sometimes arrives when people sense time is shortening and unfinished business becomes urgent, that she had given up a baby for adoption in her early 20s. A girl, born in Ohio, in 1972. Paul had submitted the DNA test partly because of what his mother told him, partly hoping someone would find him, or he would find them. I was born in Ohio, in 1972. I sat on the floor of my bedroom in Tucson, Arizona, with a stranger's voice in my ear, and I thought about my mother's hands teaching me to fold dish towels in thirds, my father's nose that everyone always mentioned, the particular shape of my own hands that nobody in my family could ever account for. And then something else arrived with a clarity that nearly took the breath out of me. My parents had adopted me. My parents, kind, loving, present, entirely real in every way that mattered, had raised me as their biological child and never told me, had gone to their graves with the truth in their possession, and not once, in 52 years, found the moment or the will to say it out loud. I was not Eleanor's daughter by blood. I was Dorothy's, a woman I had never met, 81 years old and fading, who had made a decision in her early 20s and carried it every single day since, who had a son named Paul who sounded on the phone like someone who had been quietly hoping for exactly this. I said to Paul, "I need to call you back." "I need a few minutes," he said. "Of course. I've waited 2 years. I can wait a few more minutes." I hung up. I put the phone on the floor beside me, and I sat in the silence of my bedroom, thinking about my daughter waiting at the kitchen table. We were both adopted. Neither of us had known the full truth until tonight. I went back to the kitchen. Nadia was still at the table, hands wrapped around her coffee, waiting. I sat down across from her, put my hands flat on the table, and I told her everything. Not the edited version, not the version shaped for comfort or for protecting what remained of my authority as her parent. The full version, in the order it happened. The separation from Thomas, the decision I am not proud of, the pregnancy, the miscarriage, the buried question that had stayed buried for 16 years. And then Paul, Dorothy, Ohio 1972, the parents who had raised me and taken the truth with them when they died. All of it, at the same kitchen table where she had told me I wasn't her real mother, at the same table where I had made her eggs and packed her lunches and sat beside her through 16 years of homework and heartbreak and ordinary Tuesday evenings. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look away. She sat completely still in the way I now recognize as her processing mode, which looks from the outside like detachment, but which I have learned over 22 years means she is taking in every single word. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I started to be afraid of it. Then she said, "So we're both adopted." "Yes," I said. "And you didn't know?" She said. "No," I said. "Not until tonight." She looked at me across the table for a long time, and then she said something I was not prepared for, something I have thought about nearly every day since. "You spent your whole life not knowing where you came from, and you still showed up for me every single day." I did not have words for that. I just looked at my daughter across the kitchen table and felt something between us shift. Not break, not crack, shift. Into something more honest than what we had before. Something more equal. Something that felt, strangely, like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. The bandage from the burned hand was long gone by then, but I thought about it. The months after were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because stories that skip the aftermath are lying about how things actually heal. I called Paul back the following morning. We spoke for 2 hours, both of us careful. Both of us moved in ways neither had fully prepared for. He had spent 2 years with the profile up, half expecting this call, half dreading it. His mother Dorothy, when he told her we had connected, cried for a long time. He said she kept repeating one word: good, good, good. I flew to Atlanta in February. I sat beside a woman I had never met in a memory care facility where the hallways smelled like antiseptic and the television was always on too loud. She was small. She had good days, and days that were somewhere else entirely. On this particular day, she was somewhere in between. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. I held her hand because I didn't know what else to do with mine. Then she said, with a clarity that broke through everything, "You have my hands." I looked down. She was right. Thomas found out the way Thomas finds out most things. From me. Directly. When I was ready. He took it better than I expected, and worse than I hoped, which is about right for Thomas and always has been. He felt excluded from something significant. That was fair. He felt that our shared history had been partially rewritten. That was also fair. We had several hard conversations over several months, and arrived eventually at something that resembled understanding, if not complete peace. We are not together, and we are not enemies. We are two people who raised a daughter, and are figuring out what remains of each other after that. Nadia met Paul in the spring. She called him Uncle Paul within the first hour of meeting him, which made him laugh with a fullness that surprised me. It made me cry, which she then made fun of for the rest of the afternoon, which is how I knew things between us were going to be genuinely all right. The door to her birth mother through the DNA database is still there. She has not opened it. That is entirely hers. On her own schedule. In her own time, I have told her I support either choice completely. I mean it the way I have always meant things, all the way through. My daughter told me I wasn't her real mother. She was 16. She was angry. She was pressing on the edges of herself to see where they were. Sometimes that means pressing on the people closest to you to see if they will hold. I held. And the DNA test she ordered, the one she was so certain about, did show her something. Just not what she expected. It showed her that identity is not a simple thing, that the stories we carry about ourselves are sometimes incomplete. That truth, even when it arrives late and sideways, and costs something to receive, is almost always better than the version you have been living inside. I am a woman who was adopted and didn't know it until she was 50 years old. My daughter is a woman who was adopted and knew it since she was 5. We found out within weeks of each other that we both came from somewhere we hadn't fully known about. And instead of that pulling us apart, which it could have, which it threatened to for a while, it gave us something neither of us had expected. It gave us the same shape of story, not the same details. Our circumstances are entirely different, but the same fundamental question: where do I come from, and does it change who I am? We had been asking it side by side for years, without knowing we were asking it together. The DNA test didn't answer the question. It just finally let us ask it in the same room. Nadia calls me on Sunday mornings sometimes. No agenda. Just to talk. I sit on my back porch with Gerald at my feet and my coffee going cold, and I think about the kitchen table and the dish towel folded in thirds and the bandaged hand and the look on her face when she reached across and put her hand over mine. A very long way to travel, worth every mile. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Would you have told your daughter everything the way Miriam did, or would you have kept part of it back? Subscribe for a new story every week. Every single one earns its ending.